Shalom Aleichem, everyone. Hope everyone's doing well. Be'ezat Hashem. Today in Masechet Sanhedrin, we're going to learn Tet Zayin Amud Bet 16b. We're going to start the first two dots on the page. Ve'en mosifin ala'ir. It's about 8 or 10 lines down from the top of the page. And we're going to have really two sections in today's learning. The first section, again, talking about the practices that only the Sanhedrin Agdolah, the great Sanhedrin of 71, were allowed to do. So we'll talk about adding on to the city of Yerushalayim, the azarot, as well as formulating the smaller capital courts of 23. The second section we'll focus in is on hanidachat with a series of halachot relating to the Sanhedrin of 71 and also related halachot that we had said in the Mishnah to show the sources for these things. Azat Hashem, our learning today, and as always, is a zechut, should be a merit for the refuah shlema of Yaakov ben Dinah. He should have a speedy, quick, and full recovery, and we should only know and hear besorot tovot, good news. Let's begin towards the top of Tet Zayin Amud Bet, ve'en mosifin ala'ir. So we were talking about a series of halachot that only the Sanhedrin Agdolah, the great Sanhedrin of 71, were allowed to do. And in this specific section, we said if they wanted to add on to the city of Yerushalayim, or onto the azarot, which is even holier, the courtyards of the Beit HaMikdash, they needed the Sanhedrin of 71 to participate. So the Gemara here shows us what is the source for this idea. Now really the underlying point is there's Kedusha, there's holiness associated with Yerushalayim in general, and particularly more so even with the azarot. So where do we find this idea that when inaugurating, or as we're going to see, adding on to this holiness, you need the court of 71 in order to do that properly? And the source, like we have quoted above for a few of them, is going to be from Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Gemara says like this, Menani Mili, where do we know that the court of 71 was required to add on to the city or the azarot? Amar Rav Shimi bar Chia, Amar Kra. It's based on a pasuk. The pasuk tells us in Terumah, when it talks about sanctifying the Mishkan, it says, Kechol asher ani mareh otcha, all that I've shown you, Moshe, who Moshe we know is equivalent to the 71 because he was the head of the Sanhedrin, et tavnit ha-mishkan, the image of the Mishkan, v'chein ta'asu, keywords, and so you shall do. Now that implies in the future. Ledorot habayin. So the Gemara says this teaches us not only was Moshe, who was like 71 of the Sanhedrin in his day, empowered and required to inaugurate the Mishkan in those times, but also in the future. If you want to add on to the Kedusha, i.e. expanding Yerushalayim or the azarot, you need a court of 71 in that process for it to be effective. Again, because Moshe is equivalent to 71. Mativ Rav asked the question. The Braita teaches Kol HaKelim Sha'asa Moshe Meshichatan Mekadshan. All of the vessels that Moshe Rabbeinu sanctified, or that he made, for the Mishkan, all of the kelim, meshichatan mekadshan. It was the sanctity imbued with the oil. It was a special anointing oil the Psukim talk about that imbued them with their kedusha. Mekan ve'elech, but if kelim were made after his days, means if some of the kelim of the Mishkan broke or needed to be replaced, if you make new ones, avodatan mechanchatan, it's not the oil that anoints them, but rather it is the usage into its service that inaugurates them into proper service. So unlike in the days of Moshe, says the Braita, that if Moshe made these kelim, he anointed them with oil and that would sanctify them into service. In the future, it was actually the avodah, the actual work with it, that inaugurated it into service. Asks the Gemara, V'amai, why is this true? Nemo, we should say, V'chein ta'asu l'dorot habayin. If V'chein ta'asu teaches us, just like Moshe did, that's how it was meant to be done in the future. For example, regarding the Sanhedrin needing to inaugurate by adding on to the azarot or Yerushalayim. So also, l'chora, regarding the inauguration of kelim into service, like Moshe used that oil, should also be necessary for new kelim to have those oils, that oil used for its inauguration. So why does the Braita make this distinction that it's not the oil in the future that makes it prepared for service, but it's the work itself? So the Gemara answers, it's a good question, but Shani Atam, in regards to that distinction, it's different. The Amar Kra, because the Pasuk tells us in Naso, when it talks about the kelim, it says, Vayimshachem, Vayikadesh otam. He anointed them and he sanctified otam. Otam is a mi'ut, it's an exclusion. Otam, those kelim in the days of Moshe that he used and he brought to be used in the Mishkan, b'mishicha. Those were inaugurated into service specifically by Yimshachem through oil. V'lo ledorot b'mishicha, but it excludes in the future. They don't need to be anointed into service to be usable. Rather, it's only through the avodah. Asks the Gemara, but maybe you could say the drasha, the mi'ut of otam differently. Ve'ema otam b'mishicha u'ledorot o b'mishicha iba avodah. Maybe what the drasha is that specifically in the days of Moshe, the only avenue of preparation for service was with the oil. But in the future, maybe you have two options. Maybe it's either with avodah or with oil. Learn the drasha a little bit differently. Rav Papa answers, there's a different pasuk, because Amar Kra, the pasuk tells us in Bamidbar, and this, we're interpreting this verse to mean in the future service, if you make new kelim, Asher Yeshartu Bam Bakodesh, it says that they will be prepared into service to be used in the temple. And the way we're understanding Yeshartu is in the future. So the way we interpret the verse is, Hakatuv Tala'an B'Sherut. Sherut means service. How do they be sanctified, the kelim in the future, which is what this verse in Bamidbar is talking about, is through sherut, is through actual usage. That's what the pasuk is telling us. Asks the Gemara, okay, but now you know this idea that kelim that are made in the future are inaugurated not with the oil, but rather through service, through working with them. You learn it out from Asher Yeshartu Bam Bakodesh. So why do you need otam, the original pasuk, which seemed to create this exclusion for the same drasha? Elo otam lamali. So why do I now need otam? So the Gemara answers, Ilav otam. If I did not have otam and I only had Asher Yeshartu Bam Bakodesh, Hava Amina, I would have said Ledorot B'Mshicha Uva Avodah. Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu's days, the way to inaugurate the kelim was with the oil. In the future, you need the oil and service. Both are necessary to inaugurate the kelim into service in the Mishkan. Based on the verse of V'chein ta'asu. So you should say, you need the oil like Moshe, and you need also it to be used into service, it to be prepared via usage. So therefore, katav rachmana otam. Therefore, we have the pasuk we quoted above. Otam is the mi'ut. Otam b'mishicha, specifically Moshe Rabbeinu's kelim. Those kelim were inaugurated through oil. V'lo ledorot b'mishicha, but for future generations is not with oil. Specifically, it's through service, and not with oil is it inaugurated into service in the Beit HaMikdash or in the Mishkan. Let's continue. Sanhedrin chules. We said in the Mishnah that you're not allowed to set up a system of Sanhedraot, the smaller courts of 23, for the different tribes, unless the 71-person Sanhedrin Agdolah, was engaged with it. Meaning, in order to set up the lower capital courts, the 71-person Sanhedrin was the key player. They had to be involved. It wasn't allowed to be set up by anyone else. So the Gemara is Minal. Where do we know this from? Answers the Gemara again, like Moshe Rabbeinu, Kedashkachen b'Moshe. We find regarding Moshe, the Oki Sanhedrot, he established the Sanhedrin. Moshe b'makom shiv'im b'chad kayin, and Moshe was in place of 71. Again, he was the head of the Sanhedrin. He was considered equivalent to the Sanhedrin Agdolah. So Rashi points out over here, where do we know he set up the 23-person courts? That was the suggestion of Yitro in Parashat Yitro. Yitro tells him, set up the lower courts. Moshe was the one who set them up. So too in the future, when you set up the lower courts of 23 for capital punishment, you also need the 71-person court to set them up. Now, the Gemara, based on the fact that we introduced this, now talks about setting up courts in general. Where you need to set them up, for which sectors, and the Braita now elaborates on this. Tanu Rabbanan, says the Braita, Menayin shema amidin shoftin liYisrael. How do we know that you need to set up judges, that there's a requirement to set up judges, justice system for the Jewish people? Talmud Lomar, therefore, in the beginning of Parashat Shoftim, it says, now it's a little bit of a chopping up the pasuk, but Shoftim titen, you shall place Shoftim, judges for the Jewish people. So that's how we know you need judges for the Jewish people, which in the context here means set up lower courts of 23 to judge the Jewish people. Shotrim Yisrael Minayin. How do we know also you have to set up Shotrim? Now Rashi learns Shotrim are essentially the enforcers of the psak of the Shoftim. Rashi learns Gul Yarim Choftim b'makalot al pi Shoftim b'chol mi she'eno shomea. Policemen who would hit the litigants if they don't listen to the psak of the judges. So this is the Shotrim. How do we know Shotrim? These types of enforcers also need to be set up for the Jewish people. Talmud Lomar, therefore the pasuk says, Shotrim titen, again, utilizing the pasuk as it teaches us, is placed Shotrim also, the enforcers are also necessary. So you need judges, you need enforcers. Shoftim l'chol shevet v'shevet minayin. How do we know that you have to set up judges for every tribe? Talmud Lomar, Shoftim lishvatecha. The same pasuk there, it says, place judges lishvatecha for your tribes. Shotrim l'chol shevet v'shevet minayin. Also, how do we know you put enforcers in each tribe? Talmud Lomar, Shotrim lishvatecha. That's why it says Shotrim for your tribes. Shoftim l'chol ir ve'ir minayin. How do we know you have to place judges for every city as well? Talmud Lomar. So some add in over here. Shoftim bechol sharech bechol lisharecha. Or Shoftim lisharecha. You shall place judges for your cities. And your cities in the context are bechol in all your cities, meaning is that each city needed a court as well. Shotrim l'chol ir v'ir minayin. How do we know that you also have to have enforcers in each city? Talmud Lomar Shotrim l'sharecha. Also it says enforcers for each city. So Tosafot points out over here, why would you need both drashot? That you need judges in every city as well as every tribe. So he says because it could be that you have one city that is split up. There's two tribes in one city. So in such a city, it wouldn't be sufficient to have one court. You need two different courts. One for one shevet, one for the other shevet. Rabbi Yehuda is not arguing, he's just adding. He says, Echad memuna al kulan. One person has to be, or one court has to be appointed over all of them, meaning we need the 71-person Sanhedrin on top of all of this. Shne'amar, like it says, Titen lecha, you shall place them, is they appoint them in the beginning. They're the ones that are ultimately on top of all of these lower courts. Rabbi Shmuel adds another point, which is, it says, for your tribes and they shall judge. What does it teach us? Mitzvah b'shevet ladun et shivto. So it's a mitzvah. This teaches us that the shevet should be judged by its own courts, meaning is that within Shevet Reuven, they're going to have their own court of Shevet Reuven. They shouldn't go to Shimon to be judged by their court. Rather, they should be judged by the court of Shevet Reuven, and each other shevet was the same as well. This is actually a very important lesson, which is similar to the Gemara. It's actually in Masechet Rosh Hashanah that talks about we only have the judges of our days or the rabbis of our days, etc. There's a certain relationship that the judges or the rabbis of your day, of your section, for example, Reuven, have that would allow them to judge in the most appropriate way. Perhaps they understand their people the best, and therefore the Gemara tells us it's most appropriate, and that's what the Pasuk is telling us. They should be judged by their tribe and not by someone else's shoftim, not by someone else's tribe. Give me 1 second here. Okay, let's go ahead. Moving on now to the second section in the Gemara, the Gemara of today. We said in the Mishnah, ve'eno sin ir hanidachat. We said that a ir hanidachat, which is a subverted city, meaning that the majority of the inhabitants of the city engage in avodah zarah, and there's special halachot about such a thing that are not the same for when an individual does avodah zarah. For example, the contents of the city need to be destroyed. The people who did the avodah zarah are killed by sayif, by the sword, unlike the normal death, which is skila for someone who does avodah zarah. We also said in this distinction that the ir hanidachat is judged by the court of 71, unlike normal capital cases, perhaps where a person individually does avodah zarah, that would be judged by a court of 23, like normal capital cases. So the Gemara says, Menani Mili. Where do we know this from? That the ir hanidachat is adjudicated in a court of 71, the Sanhedrin Agdolah. Amar Rabbi Bar Yosef, Amar Boshayed, Amar Kra. So the pasuk tells us these pasukim talk about hanidachat, and this is not by hanidachat. This is actually by regular people who do avodah zarah. And it says there, v'otzeita et ha'isha hu o et ha'isha hi. You shall bring out that man or that woman, and they are stoned. The normal case of avodah zarah. So we learn from this, ish v'isha tamotz ilisharecha, that normally, if it's an individual, so they're adjudicated when they do avodah zarah, lisharecha, which means in your lower capital courts of 23. We had this drasha earlier, but if it's a city that does avodah zarah like this, hanidachat, that would need to be judged not in a court of 23, but rather in the greater court of 71 of the Sanhedrin Agdola. Okay. Now, when we're talking about the hanidachat, so he went on with further halachot. So one of the halachot is you're not allowed to have an hanidachat on the border of Eretz Yisrael. Says the Gemara, my time, but what's the reason? But this pasuk that we're quoting here appears in Parashat Re'eh, where it talks about the idea of the hanidachat. And the pasuk says, Mikir Becha. It says, the city in your midst. That's a city, it says, Yatz'u Anashim B'nei Blial Mikir Becha. People in the city that is in your midst started to do avodah zarah. So Amar Achmana, the Torah says, V'lo min asfar. So it teaches us it has to be actually in your midst. So it's a drasha. As opposed to if it's on the border, it's not in your midst, it's on the border of Eretz Yisrael, that cannot become a hanidachat. It's a very interesting thing. You don't make that into an hanidachat to destroy it, but if it's on the middle of the Eretz Yisrael, you would. But if it's on the border, you don't make that into hanidachat. And the Mishnah continued, Velo shalosh, also, 3 cities cannot become hanidachat. So let's see what exactly is the source for this, and we'll explain the qualifications of this ruling. We said in the Mishnah, 3 cities cannot be made into hanidachat and be destroyed. How do we know this? Because the pasuk tells us also, in that context, it says, Ki tishma ba'achat she'arecha, when you hear in one of your cities. Now, achat means one, arecha is plurality. So the Gemara says like this, Tichtiv achat. So first of all, it says 1. So 1 teaches you that 1 city could be made into an hanidachat. Avalosin achat oshtayim, but you could have 1 or 2 as the hanidachat, means even 2, because it says arecha is plural. So therefore it teaches you that even 2 could be made into hanidachat and destroyed, but more than that, 3 you can't have as an hanidachat, as we said in the Mishnah. Tanu Rabbanan, the Braita elaborates, achat velo shalosh. So achat teaches us in the pasuk that only 1 could be made into an hanidachat and destroyed, but not 3. Now we'll explain momentarily. The Amoraim will teach us exactly what it means, not 3. We have to see what does it mean in the same area, in the same time. We'll see exactly what this means. But for now, the Braita teaches us 1 city could be made into hanidachat, but not 3. Ata omer achat velo shalosh. You want to say it's 1 and not 3. Oeno ela achat velo shtayim. Usually 1 would exclude 2, the plurality of it. So maybe it excludes you can't make 2 into an hanidachat. Kishu omer arecha, but since the Torah says you could make arecha is plural, your cities, into hanidachat, harei shtayim amor, so the minimum of plurality is 2. So you see, you could make 2 into hanidachat. Hamani mekayim achat. So then what is the exclusion of 1 teaching us? Achat velo shalosh, that 3 cannot be made into hanidachat, but 2 could, because the Torah is not excluding 2, it's only excluding 3. Now, to qualify exactly, we say one city could be made into hanidachat and destroyed, 2 could also, but not 3. So what are we talking about? See, is it the same time period, the same area? What are we talking about exactly? So let's see. The Gemara says like this. Zimnin, there's 2 versions of Rav on this. Sometimes, Amar Rav used to say, Beit din echad hu de'ein osim. If you have 1 court, meaning 1 Sanhedrin, because they're the ones who would engage with this hanidachat, which means it's the same Sanhedrin that already made 1 and 2 hanidachat in Eretz Yisrael. They can't make a 3rd. Hu de'ein osim. Ha b'shnayim v'shlosha batei dinin, but if it was multiple courts, meaning the Sanhedrin, they had a turnover already. The members of the Sanhedrin passed away and they were replaced already. So now you have a new Sanhedrin, Osin. Then they were already allowed to make 3 different cities, obviously different time periods, into hanidachat. You could have even 3 hanidachat. So the first version of Rav was that when we say you can't have 3 hanidachat, it means if it's the same members of the Sanhedrin. But if it's different members because the Sanhedrin passed away and they were replaced, now you could make 3 hanidachat. But other times, Rav said differently, version 2, even if it was a turnover, means even if it was members different people, that there was such a turnover, Lo'olam Eino Sin, you're still not allowed to make multiple, 3 cities of Ir hanidachat. My time at the Rav. What is the reasoning of Rav? Mishum korcha, because you're going to make a bald spot in Eretz Yisrael. 1 second. Now, it's not clear. The Gemara doesn't clarify right now. But the point is that one second. The point is that even if it was 2 or 3 courts, means they had a turnover of the Sanhedrin, according to the second version of Rav, it would be a problem to make 3 cities into Ir hanidachat because it makes too much desolation, like a bald spot in Eretz Yisrael. Now, it's not clear. According to the second version, I just want to point something out. Okay, what if you had 4 courts, meaning there was already more of a turnover? The Pashtut, I would say there, you could make 3 into an Ir hanidachat, but 2 or 3, you would not be allowed to. I guess that would be too close together, as we explained. Okay, let's move on. Amar Reish Lakish commented, he said like this issue of making 3 cities of Ir hanidachat, lo shanu ela b'makom echad. It's only an issue if they were made 3 of them in one region. Aval b'shnayim v'shlosha mekomot, but if it's in 2 or 3 different regions, meaning you had 2 or 3 different regions where there were altogether 3 different Ir hanidachat, osin, that would be permissible. Rabbi Yochanan Omar, but Rabbi Yochanan argued, he said, En osin mishum korcha. No. Even if it's in 3 different regions, you can't make 3 different Ir hanidachat seemingly at the same time. That would be problematic. Why? Mishum korcha, again, because you make desolation, you make a bald spot in Eretz Yisrael. And the Braita supports the position of Rabbi Yochanan. Tanya kavatei Rabbi Yochanan. There's a Braita that supports Rabbi Yochanan that even in different regions, you can't have 3 different Ir hanidachat seemingly at the same time. Like the Braita says, Ein osin shalosh azarot menudachot be'Eretz Yisrael. You're not allowed to make 3 different Ir hanidachat in Eretz Yisrael. Aval osin otam shtayim. You could make 2 cities of Ir hanidachat. Kegon achat b'Yehuda v'achat b'Galil. For example, in different regions. One is in Yehuda, the south area of Eretz Yisrael, and the other is in Galil, the northern area. Aval shtayim b'Yehuda v'shtayim b'Galil. But to have 2 Ir hanidachat in Yehuda and 2 in Galil, ein osin. You're not allowed to do, because then you would have 3 simultaneously, even though they're in different regions, and that would be problematic. V'smucha lesfar. Now, if it was near the border, afilu achat ein osin. Even 1 Ir hanidachat would not be appropriate to make. Sorry, before we see this, but the point is, you see from the Braita, even in multiple regions, you can't have 3 different Ir hanidachat because you're making this korcha, you're making a bald spot in Eretz Yisrael. The desolation is too significant. But continues the Braita, like we said before, if there's a city near the border, you're not allowed to make that into a Ir hanidachat on the border of Israel. My time, so says the Braita, what's the reason? Because Shema Yishma'u Nochrim v'yacharivu et Eretz Yisrael. This is a border city. So the Nochrim, the Gentiles living outside of Eretz Yisrael, might hear, and they'll see, look, now there's this desolate area. We're able to go in and destroy Eretz Yisrael. We can use this as an entryway. Unfortunately, we had that recently, but we can use it as an entry path to get into Eretz Yisrael and cause destruction. So the Gemara says, wait a second. Earlier today, in today's sugya, we said that's not based on a logic, that's a logical thing. We said it's based on a pasuk. It says in the pasuk, mikirbecha, in your midst, you can only make Ir hanidachat when it's a city that's within the borders, not on the border. So why are you telling me in the Braita it's a logical thing if it's really based on a pasuk? Asks the Gemara, v'tepok li de mikirbecha, Amar Achman. The Torah says mikirbecha, v'lo min asfar, and you can't make an Ir hanidachat if it's on the border, but it's not based on logic, it's based on a pasuk. So the Gemara answers, Rabbi Shimon, the Tana of the Braita, is the position of Rabbi Shimon. The Darish Ta'ama Dekra. Rabbi Shimon's Shita, his opinion throughout Shas, is a famous Shita that he was Doresh Ta'ama Dekra. What does that mean? Is that he expounded the reasonings of the Psukim, which means that if he saw a pasuk, halacha, mitzvah that comes from the Torah, he would give the reasons for that, and actually, it wasn't just a nice thing that he did to give us a better understanding of the pasuk, but actually there's halachic implications for this as well, because he used to understand the psukim based on reasonings that he would provide. So the point is that in the context too, it's true. It says mikirbecha, which teaches us that you can't have a hanidachat that is on a border city from the pasuk, but he's giving a reason for that. What's the reasoning for that? The reasoning for that is because that'll cause an open entry point for the goyim to get into Eretz Yisrael, and that could cause tremendous destruction. Okay, we are going to stop here at the bottom of Tet Zayin Amud Bet. Bezrat Hashem will pick up tomorrow with Yud Zayin Amud Aleph. And in the meantime, I wish everybody a wonderful day.